I wanted to say thank you to Tammy. Thank you to Angel, Desmond, Jules, and Cassius, if I'm saying that correctly, for your really lovely email. It was great to get. I was honored to get it and really pleased to be here to talk to you about my work.
Well, we thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've thought, I'm going to give you a lecture that is going to use my website. I'm in my studio right now, and I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm going to use my website a lot to show you. I'm going to do what I call my kitchen sink lecture, which starts from when I was a kid and goes all the way up through now. So I'm about to be 49, so that'll give me about a minute a year, I think. But I timed it. I think it's going to come out. I have technically, I have until 3:30, so I'm happy to stay a little late if necessary to answer questions, or whatever you guys want.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. I'm going to ask you to do me a favor when I do screen share, because I'm going to be showing you images from my website. For some reason, I can't see the chat. So if for some reason you need to contact me, just somebody unmute and talk to me. If you could, that would be great. So before I, talk to you about my work, what I'd like to do with this lecture is I would like to talk to you about what my inspiration is, where my ideas come from, and how my process has changed over the years. And because you are students, and I was once an art student like you, I also want to talk about my disappointments and failures over the past 30 years since I graduated undergraduate in 1992, because they're all sort of in the mix and they're a part of it. So that's just going to sort of take you through kind of chronologically. Before I share my website with you and go through some work, I just want to let you know that when I was a kid, I fell in love with drawing. And just a quick story, when I was 2 years old, my stepfather tells this story that he liked to watch hockey, and I would draw little rectangles and that I called them pucka-puckas, and I would draw them and laugh and fall over on the floor laughing. And that moment, and I remember that a little bit, and that moment is what I'm always after when I'm drawing. And I'm really glad to be talking to an advanced drawing class because drawing is the thing that is core to my work. I'm going to show you some paintings and prints too, but I am a drawer, absolutely. And so I just wanted to share that story. That's sort of a through line that runs through what I'm going to show you and talk to you about is my response to what happens when my process gets stale and becomes not fun, and how I try to go back to that, and back to those drawings. I wish I still had some of those drawings, but I don't. So let's see if the technology piece is always the thing I'm most nervous about. All right. Try to move this. Can I just get some thumbs up if you can see my website? Okay, great. So I'm going to start with me as an undergraduate student. So I went to the Rhode Island School of Design, and I went there with the intention of becoming an illustrator. But my path was a little diverged at some points. My freshman year, I had a really amazing drawing professor who taught me to love charcoal. Do any of you also love charcoal? Anybody a charcoal lover? Not so much. Okay, Tammy loves charcoal. All right, Metza. I was very resistant to charcoal. My high school teacher, I was drawing with H pencils, and she said, Ben, you got to go darker. And she tried to get me to use charcoal. I wouldn't do it. But then, of course, when you're in art school and you're in a 7-hour drawing studio and you're drawing naked people for 7 hours, you're going to use charcoal. And so that was my first love. And my freshman year, I really benefited from some great instruction in all of the technical aspects of drawing that I wanted to improve in. I wanted to work from the figure. I wanted to get a better proportion, anatomy, all of those things. And when you do a 7-hour class for 14 weeks, you're going to get better at that. Then I became an illustration major, and I was really pretty sure I wanted to be an illustrator until about my third year in the program. I had become very stale in what I was doing. A lot of my professors were looking at my work and thinking and telling me like, I don't see where you're going to fit into the illustration world. I remember we had a great class where professional illustrators would come in and give us assignments. For instance, we had to, a romance cover novel illustrator came in and we had to do a romance cover novel. And I disturbingly had to use my parents as models for this, which was really upsetting. Probably should have gone to some therapy for that. We also had a woman who designed paper plates come in, and she gave us an assignment to make paper plates for Halloween. And I got a terrible critique. And my professor told me, he said, Ben, these plates that you're making are even too creepy for Halloween paper plates, because I had just taken it in this weird direction. So around my junior year, I contacted my old drawing professor and I said, can we do an independent study? I am really frustrated. And he asked me a really important question. And the question was, he looked at all my illustration work and he said, Ben, when was the last time drawing was fun for you? And I thought about it. And aside from his class, it was really when I was a kid. When I was a kid, a little bit older than 2, my mom would bring home these architectural plans that she had donated, and I would draw all over them. I would draw spaceships and robots and spaceship robot battles and sort of use the architectural plans. And that was really what was fun to me. And so he gave me some constraints, which are really important. I'm going to talk more about constraints throughout the lecture. And the constraints were, he didn't want me to use any photos, and he wanted me to work big, and he wanted me to use a material that I couldn't be too precious with. So, and other than that, it was totally up to me what I did and in this independent study. So he suggested that I just work from my imagination, because that's what I had been doing when I was a kid and I was having so much fun. So that's what I did. So I got these big pieces of Stonehenge, I think, charcoal, some Conti crayon, just a little bit of detail, but not too much. And I started working from my head. And what happened was, I'll just share this. Oops. Sorry. What happened was I had all of this imaginative imagery sort of in reserve that had been building up. And I made this drawing, which I don't think is a great drawing, but it was one of the most enjoyable experiences that I had had up until that point. I had worked, for this drawing, I had started on one sheet of paper, and when I wanted to add another sheet, I just added another sheet and taped it on the back with duct tape, because that's what I had. So this drawing is made out of 4 sheets of paper. Some other things that I did that I had not done before was, because I was layering so much, erasers weren't working for me. So my professor said, well, why don't you just use some sandpaper? So I started to sand back into it, where, in some spots you can see, like right here. Can you see my cursor when I move it? Okay, like in this area, you can see some sanding. Also, I deliberately left things not fully rendered and defined, which, unlike the illustration work I was doing, was something that I had not experienced in a while. So I still have this drawing, and it's something that I go back to and look at. In terms of what is being depicted in the drawing, there's some imagery here that you'll see also in my later work. There are pipes. I am a lover of pipes and scaffolding and things of that nature. And so these are things that I gravitate to aesthetically. This is and my idea for this was that it was sort of a petrified bird skeleton. I have no idea where these images came from. All I know is that I was sort of working in that surrealistic automatic style and letting things come out. I also was working with the figure. This was another drawing I did during that series, and a larger drawing. And if you can see, it's very hard to see, these are legs and feet of figures that are sitting, and these are drains. I am still a lover of drains. I just love that image and the idea of that, things being poured through other things. It's just something that appeals to me. I also started using watered down gesso to sort of redefine shapes and work back into things. So in the background, you see this watered down gesso. And although it's very hard to see, I started working with a blue pen. Um, in my sketchbook these days, I use almost exclusively blue pens. I think it relates back to the blueprints that I was working from. When I graduated from undergraduate, I took a year off and I built a portfolio for graduate school, or I tried to. And I also worked as a barista in Boston before there was the word barista. So this is like 1997. I made a really good latte, by the way, and I still do on my Breville espresso machine, which may be the best purchase I've ever made. So this is a drawing I did based on the neighborhood that I lived in Boston, the Boston area called Jamaica Plain, and there's a lot of triple-decker houses. I've always had a strong interest in architecture, and my last year in Rome, my last year at RISD, I also studied in Rome for about 6 weeks, which was incredibly inspiring to me. Probably still some of the best 6 weeks of my life was, when I was in Rome. And so if you look in this area, this is a very abstracted, stylized version of one of the triple-decker houses in my neighborhood. This piece is called Street Undulations. And these drawings, when I look at them now, they look very, they have a lot of ambiguity to them. They are not necessarily as skillful as I would maybe want them to be, but I really still enjoy the rawness of them. There's also, if you look in this area, a little bit of a suggestion of the interior dome of the Pantheon in Rome, which I'm still obsessed with to this day. I was just looking up the other day how the Pantheon was built and how that dome was built. A really interesting story. So I spent about a year building up my portfolio for graduate school. I applied to about 7 graduate schools and I got into 1. So that's where I went. And that was Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. I had never been to Michigan before, and nobody told me, except for when it was too late, that if you want to live in Michigan, you have to have a car. I did not have a car. I was dropped off. Has anybody ever spent time in Michigan or in that area? Anyway, first of all, they call soda pop, which is really upsetting to a Bostonian and very confusing. Also, I was in this beautiful campus in graduate school, but it took me 20 minutes just to get just to get to a 6-lane highway. And then to walk to a store was another 20 minutes. So it's a little bit of an aside, but don't move to Michigan if you don't have a car. So when I got to graduate school, just fast forward through that, as with many grad programs, my professor and my peers really were expecting and encouraging all of us to make a departure from our work, right? To take a left turn, to take risks. And I was very resistant to that. I've always been resistant to change. And I was really sort of, a little stubborn about sticking with what was working for me. I did a couple of pieces that I thought I enjoyed. This is one of them. And this is the first time I'm sort of dealing with the idea of a cross section, which is a theme that comes back to in my work a lot and something that I'm really obsessed with. I have this great book of, I think it's Stephen Beasley's cross sections, where all these illustrations of cross sections of cruise ships and arenas and all these things. It's really wonderful. And the thing that always has interested me about cross sections is the idea that you are revealing a secret. And that's something that I've always been interested in and always wanted to depict in my work. Like I'm sharing something with the viewer that they wouldn't normally see. But I was still getting a lot of encouragement to change things up. So eventually I succumbed to that pressure, and I'm glad I did. I decided that I wanted to really learn how to oil paint. And despite the fact that I went to art school for 4 years, I really had not gotten the hang of oil painting at all. Not for any lack of my professors, but just because it was something that I had a hard time with. The other thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to see in 3-dimensional reality the forms that I was trying to create. So I started to make little clay models. And these little models are very, very, I'm going to call them goofy. They're sketches. And one of the great things about doing this was that I had no artistic ego going into this process because I'm not a sculptor. I intended to use these models as reference only. And so I really had fun in a way that reminded me of having fun when I was a kid. I was using paper clay. I was using wood glue. I actually have one. I'll just show you real quick. Camera. So this is a little one of my little goofy models. This is a truck, which it's also got as part of it a burp cloth from when my daughter was a little baby attached to it. I'm just sort of using anything that I can. But I love the process, and I spent a couple of months just making models, and then I went to trying to light them and make paintings of them. And so I painted in probably the worst way you can paint in terms of oil painting, in that this is a 42 by 42 inch painting, and I used a number 3 round brush for the whole thing. So this is not recommended. This I got very interested in understanding and being able to realistically depict shapes of light and shadow and the transitions between light and shadow in my work. And this was just for lack of a better way to paint. It's not like I thought this was the right way to paint. It's just what came naturally to me. So I made some sketches of the models. I didn't use any photographic reference. I made sketches of the models, and then I projected those sketches using an opaque projector. I don't know if you guys ever use opaque projectors. They might be out of date. Tammy, maybe you know what they are, but anyway, I used an opaque projector to project the drawings onto panel. And then for each form, I sort of painstakingly mixed each color scheme and then went ahead and painted. And it's a pretty rudimentary way of painting, but it allowed me to learn a lot about color. This is one of the few pieces I've actually ever sold. I don't sell work a lot. I spend so much time on it that usually my prices are prohibitive to people, but this was the universe smiling on me, because in my graduate thesis show, I was really broke. I had spent all of my loan money in college. I had no job lined up after graduating. And this wonderful woman who was on the board of directors at Cranbrook just came up to me. She said, "I want to buy that." And I gave her the price, and she said, "Whatever." And I thought, oh God, why didn't I double that price? But anyway, it still helped me to move. I was able to move after that back to the Boston area. So and after this series, I felt like I had learned enough about how to model light and shadow that I stopped making models for a while. So after graduate school, I moved to, oh, these are a couple of other paintings I did after just to take a break from the way that I was working. And just as an aside, these two, which I traded in graduate school, I wish I hadn't traded for other art. These two were the beginning of my interest in combining line and three-dimensional form. So this right here was a little sculpture that I made, and then I, painted it. And this is still an oil paint. These are unstretched canvas. And then this is all line work. And so these are kind of random in the sequence of things, but I come back to similar things later. So I moved to upstate New York, where I got a job teaching at a community college for a while, and I continued to work in oil paint. And the next sort of body of work is really me exploring the imagination, and these are probably the most surreal. I guess I would define them as surreal paintings. Some of them I like, some of them I don't like, and some of them I kind of look back and cringe, but they're part of my history, and so I thought it's would be interesting to show them to you. In most of these, there's some figurative element, but the machines are definitely dominant. There is a small person, maybe me, down here, little goatee there, little bald head, and anyway, yeah, there it is. So, but the machines are definitely dominant, and another quasi-figurative piece here. But I was really having fun inventing these forms. I was still enjoying painting in oils. And these are fairly small, 10 by 12, not that big. There's another figure right there. Maybe me. Eventually I got to the point technically with oil painting, not got to the point. I don't think, not saying that these are good or anything, but I reached the point where I was unsatisfied with the uniformity of the textures that I was painting, and I wanted to explore other textures. So I started to work with glazing more. So I imagine many of you have taken oil painting classes. And so I started to work with glazes, and I also started to sand back into the paintings. I was painting sometimes on canvas, sometimes on paper. So this I sanded back into, found out that oil paint does not particularly like to be sanded back into. I also became interested in going back and depicting transparencies as opposed to things that were fully opaque. So on the left-hand side of this one, I wanted to be able to see through that. The challenge that I was having, and that I had throughout the time I was using oil paint, is the drying time and also the medium. Because I was painting in an apartment, just in a room in my apartment, I didn't want to use toxic materials, so I was glazing with just linseed oil, which after a while does not want to accept other layers on top of it if you're not using sort of more proper painting technique. I was also scumbling, so I was taking dry, lighter paint and working over passages like this background area here and this. So going dark and then scumbling over light. So I was doing a lot of things that related to my interests in drawing. Eventually, the figure found its way back into my work, and I started to exclusively use glazing with oil paints. And this is the beginning of the end of my tumultuous relationship with oil paint. It was always an up and down sort of thing. But the glazing that I was doing was not satisfying to me. And a lot of these paintings, when I look back on them, I'm not terribly happy with them. And I wish they were drawings. And some of them I actually turned into drawings. But the figure is something that shows up periodically, comes back into my work, and then it disappears for a while, and then it comes back in. So these paintings, this one might be the lightest one in terms of value. A lot of my work tends to go pretty dark, pretty quick. And as with much of what I've done, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides and tell you about this piece really quickly. So I did this piece, and it was on a panel that was about 3 inches shorter than this one vertically. And I was unhappy with the composition, but I had already built the entire painting pretty much finished to that level. And I had a friend in Poughkeepsie where I was living who was a woodworker. And I brought the painting to him and I said, can you just put another 3 inches on the top of this painting? And he nicely did. And he said, are you kidding me? I was like, no. He's like, why don't you just make another painting? And I said, no, I just want 3 inches on this one. So he added another 3 inches. This is much easier to do when you're drawing. And you'll see when I show you my drawings that I do this all the time. Anyway, he made me take him out to eat in payment for that. All right, so this is a painting that I still have, that I still own, where I'm really starting to get back into drawing issues. I'm starting to get back into issues of contrast, using warms and cools instead of using more of a variety of color. And I'm starting to actually get frustrated a little bit with the medium. This was a painting that I glazed to the point where it would not accept any more glaze. I started to actually sand areas down or lightly so that they would accept more glaze on this one. And this is the beginning of the end. You can see the relationship is getting dark now. The paintings, this series of paintings has almost no black in it. This is almost all glazed color. My favorite color, oil paint color, was Old Delft blue, which I really loved. And I used to glaze that and work with layers of Old Delft blue and then burnt sienna over top that to achieve these real dark colors. The challenge was when I was in shows, a couple of shows with these paintings, they're very, very shiny and they're very hard to light. And they're very hard to see unless they're properly lit. This might be the darkest one that I made. And so about here, I'm starting to get pretty done with painting in oils. It just, the limitations are starting to frustrate me. I did a couple of more small paintings, 6x6s. And then I sort of flailed around for a while, and I went back eventually to the method that I had in graduate school. So this is about 10 years after, well, exactly 10 years after I graduated. And I said, well, I was really having a hard time in the studio. There's a lot of work at this time that I ended up throwing away. And I said, well, I'll try going back to what worked for me in graduate school. And I made this painting, which took me, because I was working full time, took me, 4 months to make, working every day on it for hours. And I wasn't happy making it. And I was only somewhat happy with the results. So I decided to stop oil painting. So that ends my oil painting career for the time being. You never know, might go back to it at some point, but not anytime soon. And then what I did is I decided I needed to go back to drawing, and I needed to give myself constraints. This is something I've struggled with in my work a lot, is what types of constraints to give myself, how much, and when to break my own rules. And so the constraints I gave myself for this series of drawings were that I was going to work 6x6. I needed just to go small again so I could get back into my detail, because I had struggled with the oil paint. And I was going to use a crow quill pen. Do you all know what a crow quill pen is? It's one of those ones you dip, which if you get a blob of ink that comes out can ruin your day. So I decided to use a crow quill pen, and to then use also white F&W acrylic ink. And this is when I really started to, and I still use this stuff today. I really love it because it's so versatile, is this acrylic ink. So a lot of these drawings are based on the paintings. So I was not, this is what that one painting layers would have looked like if I had been able to get the detail that I wanted. And I needed this time to do these small drawings just to sort of recenter myself and to fall in love with drawing again, which I did. So this was a time for me to work with imaginative invention. Again, go back to my core interests: architecture, the figure, invention. They sometimes go a little surreal. Sometimes they go very figurative. This was a drawing that I did. Those are my feet, kind of. Mine are attached to my body, unlike these, but I was really having fun again, and that was sort of the point. I also was experimenting with different ways of layering. So in some of these, I am working on top of white acrylic paint and seeing what happens when I put lines over that, as opposed to putting lines on white paper. So just little technical things. These are things that I'm always interested in. I don't think anybody who looks at my work notices, but I care about, and so that's kind of all that matters. This is one my stepfather now has. And this was based on the painting that I showed you, Arena. So I'll just go back to that so you guys can see really quickly. So that's the painting, which came first. And then that's the drawing. And I found the drawing much more satisfying to do. And I was able to really, I've always loved line. I continue to love line. And every time I've tried to work exclusively with a tone, and not do line, I always end up breaking my own rule and going back to line. This is a sort of a standalone piece I did, but sort of reinvesting myself in the figure, probably one of the more colorful pieces I've done. And it also introduced something that I'm starting to do again in my work, which is to write things into my painting. So right up here in the upper right, it says, "Don't move." These are little things that come into my mind when I'm drawing. Something I've always tried to do, which I'll talk a little bit later about, is I would love my work, my larger work, to feel like my sketchbook work. I think a lot of artists feel that way. And I have always loved the intimacy of sketchbooks. So that's just a little aside into that. So at this point, I was really struggling to find inspiration in my studio. I had another period of a lot of doubt, a lot of uncertainty. And I was taking the trash out one morning, and I live in a very hilly area in Western Massachusetts, and we live on a cut-through street that a lot of trucks come down. And I was taking the trash out and I was watching the trucks, and I just had this thought that these trucks could be really interesting to explore. I was watching them and they felt very human to me as they sort of lumbered down the street. Sometimes they felt really silly. These boxes on wheels in this huge landscape of trees. We have these big trees on our street. Sometimes they looked really kind of arrogant to me. Sometimes they looked joyful. They had, or I was projecting all of these human qualities onto them. And so that's sort of what started this next exploration of work. I was working with ink, and I then started to incorporate some other colors of ink, some browns and some blues. I didn't mean this to become a series. I just one day was like, oh, I think I'll sketch one of these trucks. But as happens, it became something that was more of a series. So I did a series of drawings, which I'm actually gone back to recently, this idea of these trucks. And the other thing that I really found interesting about them, particularly early in the morning, was the mood that they created. They created a mood that is a mood that I've always looked for when I'm watching movies. When I was a kid, there was 3 movies that my family had on VHS cassette. You probably don't even know what VHS cassettes are. I bet Tammy might not even know what VHS cassettes are. Do you? Have you heard of them?
Even beta.
Even beta. Okay, I'm impressed. I'm impressed. So, and the 3 were The Last Unicorn. Has anybody ever seen that movie? Oh, excellent. Oh, very good. Cassius, I'm impressed. The Dark Crystal. Yeah, okay, very good. And the third one was random. That was Teen Wolf, the original Teen Wolf with Michael J. Fox. Now, Teen Wolf had no influence on my work, and I'm not really interested in that aesthetic, but the first 2 did. And the first 2 I loved because they established a believable imaginary world that had mystery and wonder in it. And those 2 things, mystery and wonder, are things I've always wanted to depict and have my work evoke in the viewer. And that's something that I felt when I was drawing the trucks. Some of these are kind of more paintings than drawings. This one I made more like a watercolor painting, using washes more, not as much white ink. This was the first one that I made. It has the most sort of innocent feel to me, which I kind of like. It's not as technically maybe sophisticated as some of the others, but I still enjoy it. I did a little sanding here in the upper right, you can see. And I think this was the last one that I made, which is 12 by 9 and is a piece of paper mounted onto a board. And this is also representative of just my overall interest in textures and depicting a variety of textures within my work. It's just an aesthetic interest and preference that I have. When I felt done with that series, and usually it seems that I've go between 4 and 6 pieces in a series before the idea sort of runs its course. I went back to just free form invention, but working with the same materials for three or four pieces. What happens to me is I go through the process of exploring an idea through 4 or 5, 6 drawings, paintings, and then I start to feel sort of this tightness, and I'm like, I got to get out, and I have to do something different. So these 3 drawings, which are 13 by 13 each, are that, and they also were my way of exploring form, going back and exploring forms and lines and spaces in the same piece. So these white lines here are my way of showing something that's a form that has potential, but it maybe doesn't totally exist yet. These 3 drawings, by the way, I went very dark, and then I actually put a wash of watered down gesso over them to just to sort of pull them into a lighter range of value. And they are mostly white, black, and raw sienna ink. And I really started to fall in love with white line, and eventually got these great white gel pens, which maybe you've heard of, these Signo gel pens, which I really love. And also, although it's embarrassing to say, these Jelly Roll gel pens. Has anybody ever used any of these? I really love them, but I'm ashamed to say that I'm a Jelly Roll artist. But they're great. They're archival, apparently. So they say. I started to become interested in the figure again. So there's a few pieces after I did those drawings that this is a smaller piece. And this is another example of a composition that I had to alter. A lot of times when I feel like I've done something good, I will show my wife, who has a great eye. And this drawing was only the top 2/3 initially. And I went and I showed her, and I was proud. I was like, hey, this is pretty good, right? And she'll give me a look, and it's the look of, no, it's not pretty good. Actually, you could do a lot better. And so I always pay attention to her. And she said, you know what? You need to continue that figure all the way down to the bottom. And so I did. And of course, she was right. And it made a much better composition. This is one of my favorite compositions of the compositions that I've made in my work. I just really like the way the curve of the archway comes down and wraps around the figure and then goes back up the leg. I'm not generally proud of my compositions, but this one I felt, and I don't credit myself for this. It was really my wife who helped me with that. But this one I like. This is based on my childhood apartment, which I have a almost perfect memory of. This is exactly what the archway looked like. And I wanted to sort of go back and explore something from my childhood. There's a tiny little boy that is me, way, way, way in the back there. Hard to see just on the website here. I started to work with these characters, which I only did for a couple of drawings, in larger pieces. So this is like, it's 26 by 17, that were figurative, probably self-portrait based on, at least in some regard. And I started to expand the color palette and work with large markers, these large, I think I might have them here, which I love, these Faber-Castell big pit markers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with these, but they're great. They brush tip, and they really just yield such a great mark, and they don't smell too bad, which is nice. So I worked with those for the initial stages of this drawing and the next drawing. And then, of course, I would layer up a lot with charcoal and ink and all kinds of other stuff on top of it. If you look down at the bottom of this, you can see I added an extra 1.5 or 2 inches at the bottom. So something that that I tend to do, as has become clear. And I've always had an interest in drawings that tell a story, that are narrative in some way, something that I'm getting back to actually now in my work. And so these are an example of me sort of stepping into that direction. It's a drawing that went through many changes. And in fact, initially, the figures were, I'll call these 2 figures, that one and that one, were facing away from each other. But then I cut the drawing in half and then, replaced them and then taped it back together. in the middle to change the composition. And so this is just another example of me trying to balance spontaneity with creating a strong composition. Whenever I've tried to deliberately map out a composition, it never works. It's very interesting. Well, actually once, I think it worked once. With one of those truck drawings, I think I was able to do it. But almost always, the way that I work is by establishing something, having that dominate, establishing something else, having that dominate for a while, and then letting a few things battle each other out in the process before I need to make a decision and one thing becomes a focal point or two things become the focal point. I think this is just my brain's way of forcing me not to be too tight for too much of the process and forcing me to allow for spontaneity in my work. So for instance, this area right here was the result of me accidentally spilling some white ink and then deciding to use that and layering on top of pencil. I really love the way graphite looks on top of white ink or white gesso as opposed to charcoal. I'm not a big graphite artist, but sometimes in small doses, I think it can work really well. And so this is something that I'm constantly working with and against in my own artistic tendencies, is spontaneity versus planning something out. This is a standalone piece, not really part of any series, but something that brought together my interest in architecture and my these wheels are kind of from the truck drawings that I did. This went through many changes, and I think I used a circular sander or a belt sander at the top to get some of these marks, like really going back and sort of, as my professor used to say, torturing the paper a little bit. Okay, so now one of these is the drawing that's in the show. So when I was working with those figure drawings I just showed you, at some point I got tired of drawing the figure and I got really interested in the clothing, and I went back and forth, and part of my brain said, well, you really should just work with a figure. Your interest is figurative. But then I was reading my daughter a book one day, and is anybody familiar with Dr. Seuss? You guys know Dr. Seuss books? There's one story called, I think it's called What Was I Scared Of? And it's about these empty pair of green pants. Is that story familiar to anybody? All right, well, you can look it up if you want. It's a great story. It's about, there's a Dr. Seuss character and they keep going out at night and encountering this wandering pair of green pants and being scared of them and then freaking out. So I say that because that was one of the things that led me to think, oh, I can just do empty clothing. So Dr. Seuss is great. And I love those illustrations. So what happened when I started drawing these empty clothes is I felt like by taking the figure out, I was allowing the viewer into the drawing a little bit more, into the psychological space of the drawing. And I really like that. And as a result, I find these drawings creepy, more creepy than the ones that have the figures in them, because for me, I can get into them a little bit more psychologically. There's a little bit more space for me. I also had a really good time establishing the gesture of the clothing. I worked with really watered down ink and a big brush to establish the big shapes and have the gestures be pretty fluid, particularly in this one. And then I would go back in with the materials that I mentioned before, the charcoal, ink, and so forth, to refine things. And these are based on, the clothes that I wear. So these are kind of self-portraits in a way. And the backgrounds, the background in this one is largely more abstract and to me functions to set off the shapes of positive space. So I love working with interesting shapes of positive and negative space, and that's one thing I try to do. But this piece, the background, I wanted the figure to inhabit in a space, but I wanted that space to be in contrast to the opacity of the actual quote unquote figure. And so the figure is more opaque, and I used my, my jelly pens and my white pens in the background. And, this, the idea of social armor, it was a phrase that I was not familiar with until somebody mentioned it to me. It just kept resonating with me. And is something that I think about a lot, that we have these parts of ourselves that we present to the world, that we're comfortable presenting to the world, and that we have parts that are private or that are true selves. And what I was sort of going after was the idea that the social armor sometimes is all there is, or takes over, or dominates, and we're end up that, there's this sort of this nothing underneath the social armor. So that's what I was sort of going for. This was the last piece in that series, which my idea was for the clothing to sort of almost become planet-like, just taking over things. And it's called Manscape as a way to sort of suggest that it's about humankind, but also maybe about maleness in a way, or maleness as we experience it in Western culture. I really got into drawing these buttons. I really loved drawing these buttons. And I started to do a whole series of just based on buttons because I just love the forms, but there wasn't enough there. So they remained in my sketchbook. So after that series, I was sort of casting about for a while. So I was again in a period of not knowing what to do. My family and I went up to Montreal for vacation, and we got a tour of the old Olympic Stadium in Montreal, which was really great, and I really enjoyed a lot. And that stadium is largely vacant now. And I saw this empty stadium, and I thought to myself that these spaces really have personality. There's a lot of energy in this that's still there, still alive. So I went and I did this little drawing in my sketchbook after going to the Olympic Stadium. I play the drums, so that's why you'll see some drums up here too. And I was thinking a lot about the idea, similar to the series of clothing, of what it means to be observed, what it means to be an observer, who are we showing ourselves to? So these are the things I was thinking about. So I started off with some sketches, and then I made this series of drawings. And I really, I also went to a couple of concerts at this time in big arenas. Has anybody ever heard of Florence and the Machine? I don't know if you've heard of that group, but anyway, I went and saw her, which was great, and then Arcade Fire, and I saw them both in these big venues. And one of the things that I really love about these spaces, and that I noticed myself doing, was paying attention to the areas that we're not supposed to pay attention to. So all of the spotlights are on the screen, but I found myself looking in little corners of arenas when I was in these spaces and getting sort of obsessed with these little details. Like there's a little program in the back of this seat here and things of that nature. So the idea of paying attention to the things that are not the spectacle was something that was interesting me. Here in Boston, I don't know if you guys have arenas like this. Sometimes they'll hang banners that have like the numbers of old players. So this is way at the top there is Robert Parrish, who used to play for the Boston Celtics. That was his number, 00. Anyway, little details like that were becoming interesting. Also, I was experimenting with making the lights actually sort of look solid and heavy and three-dimensional, just to emphasize the psychology of these things being maybe almost an impediment or something that was too serious in the context of the performance. And this was the last one that I did in that series. And in this drawing, I was trying to really create the sense that the stage was almost coming at the viewers. It was almost sort of, rather than the viewers coming at the stage or looking at the stage was a thing in and of itself. I got very interested and really enjoyed paying attention to and drawing in minute detail all of the things that I thought nobody would probably look at, like these little boxes here, which when I was at the concerts, I noticed all these little boxes that were on wheels that equipment would come in. which, the roadies would use, presumably. This is probably one of my more colorful pieces too. So after this series, I needed to go back to the sketchbook. In about 2020, during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time working in my sketchbook. Fortunately, I did not take very good pictures of these drawings, but I'll just show you a couple anyway. So I decided to limit myself. I needed another constraint, so I decided to limit myself to my favorite blue pen, which is a Pilot Rollerball V5 blue pen, and just work straight from my head, no pencil, just pen, for my imagination. And as has happened again and again, my imagination came up with an idea that I then pursued, which was the idea of cross sections again. So that's something that came up years ago, and it's come back. I became, and I'm still much more interested now in more of a balance between the nature and the human made in the work. And so this was a really important little drawing for me, which I later made a larger drawing of. I also have been working on black paper with white. One of the things I'm trying to do, I've always tried to do, but have been limited in my success, is to get some whimsy and humor into my work. This was just a funny idea I had of an ancient deli case. I don't know why I thought of this. I was reading something about ancient Rome, and I thought, well, I wonder if they had deli cases back in ancient Rome. And so I made this drawing. It's very hard to read in some ways, but this is like the little thing that you would take your little deli ticket from. I don't know what kind of weird old sandwiches those are, but they're in there too. And this is another drawing that you'll see in a second. I expanded and made a bigger piece. This was one of my favorite ones that I made. I really enjoyed in making these drawings the ability to force that one visual tool that I had, which was a blue line, to do as much as possible, including relating energy, value. For some reason, unlike my other work, whenever I was doing these, I felt like I could stop at the right time and maybe not overwork things, which is something I sometimes do. All right, so to the bigger drawings. So the first one that I made was this drawing, which sadly I have since destroyed in an effort to improve it. Looking back on it, I really like it. It's in my studio right now, and it's become something else that is less successful, but that happens. Sometimes you have to sacrifice, and unfortunately I sacrificed this one. So this drawing was based on the sketch that I just showed you. And what I did was I photographed the sketch, took it into Photoshop, enlarged it, and then transferred it onto a big piece of paper, and sort of went at it with all the tools and materials that I've gone at things before. And it's called Meteor, and the idea is that it's sort of a cross section of a meteor, and there's a lot of other things going on in here. I've always been interested in the micro and macro dialogue, so things that maybe look like interior of cells, but then outer space, that kind of thing. And that drawing did have to do with that. This is also based on a sketch that I didn't show you. This was a much larger drawing that I then cut this portion out of. So in this case, I could not work the composition as it was. And so the idea became smaller rather than bigger, which sometimes happens with my stuff. And this drawing was based on one of the sketches that I just showed you. And it's the one that's behind me to the left there. So you can see the size. And so when I was doing this series, my plan, and this is so often my plan, which my interior critic rebels against, my plan was to take the sketch, enlarge it, transfer it, methodically draw it, and then have it be a done piece. But as happens a lot, something rebelled in me, and I started making spontaneous decisions, having, little mini panic attacks about it, like, oh no, follow your plan. But then, the spontaneous decisions assert themselves in my process a lot. And so I ended up making this drawing, and this one based on one of the sketches. So this is taking us up to just about present time. So that one I finished pretty recently. And for these drawings, I'm getting a little bit lighter in value, as you can see, getting a little bit more color. I almost always, if I do use color, I almost always go to a triadic primary color scheme of some sort. So reds, yellows, and blues. Different reds, different yellows, different blues. There's a lot of blue pen in this drawing. This one took me a long time to make, although it's not that big. It's 16 by 22. And this drawing is not finished, but I thought I'm going to take it down off my website after this lecture, but I wanted to show it to you because I want to talk to you about why it's not finished. I had a great critique with my stepfather, who is also a painter. I was fortunate and unfortunate to have 3 out of 4 parents who are artists. So they always have and had opinions about my work. Anyway, I had him down, and one of the things he does for me is he is great at telling me and recognizing when I want to be done with something, even though I'm not done with it. And so he gave me a great critique where he talked about the central section of this and how it seems like I want to leave it vague, but it really could use a little bit more detail and definition, especially in this area. And I looked at the drawing for a while and I thought he was right about that. So this is an in-progress piece. I know we're a little bit over 45 minutes. I'm going to show you a couple more things, and then if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I am not a printmaker by trade. I came to printmaking really late in life, and I've only made a couple things that I have on my website. Many years ago, I did a residency at a local amazing printmaking studio that we have in this area, which specializes in green printmaking. And so I'll show you just a few of these prints. These are offset relief prints. I'm not sure how many printmakers there are out there, but basically the idea is I made woodblock prints. I inked them up in this ink called Akua ink, and then I printed them onto a plastic plate, and then I printed that onto paper. So it's like a several stage process. So these are really monoprints. They also involve me just like wiping ink off of plates. They're not something I've ever shown, outside my studio, but they're something that were really helpful for me in my process to think about composition and to think about color. So I was able to experiment and learn a lot by doing these. I've shown them to some people and they're like, okay, that's not like your other work, but I still enjoy looking at some of them sometime, and they are what they are. So these are all relief prints, and a lot of times these are very layered, so they've got like 3 or 4 layers of ink run through the printing press. Sometimes I would use a stencil to block off areas. This is no, it's not a mokuhanga. It's a regular woodblock, 3-stage woodblock print of one of my trucks. And this is my most recent print, which is an etching based on the drawing that I just showed you. And this involved some major technical disasters because I'm not much of not a real printmaker. I accidentally got some of the ground baked back into the lines, and I had to spend like 3 weeks with a toothbrush and this really awful chemical, like trying to fix up the plate. But anyway, so that's a long story, but that was one of the better prints that I got off of it. So that is my lecture.